The first tremor of the coming storm wasn't thunder. It was the crunch of tires on gravel where no tires had a right to be. I was oiling the stock of my grandfather's Winchester, the scent of gun oil and old wood, a familiar comfort in the quiet of my cabin, a solitude I'd earned, a silence I'd fought for across landscapes far more hostile than these Appalachians. Then, the knock. Not a polite tap, but the officious, self-important rap of someone who believes they own the very air you breathe. Through the peephole I saw them. 2 men in ill-fitting security uniforms, cheap badges glinting dully, the kind of outfits that screamed, "Rent a cop," with delusions of grandeur. They stood on my porch, which was, last I checked, attached to my cabin on my land, deep in my woods. The nearest edge of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association was a good 2 miles down the mountain, a festering pocket of suburban neurosis I'd deliberately bought property far, far away from. Or so I thought. I opened the door, letting the heavy oak swing inward just enough. My face remained impassive, a skill honed in places where showing emotion was a death sentence. "Can I help you?" The words were level, devoid of invitation. The taller one, a beefy specimen with a mustache that looked like a confused caterpillar, puffed out his chest. "Sir, we're with Whispering Pines HOA Security. We've received multiple complaints regarding your structure." He gestured vaguely at my cabin, a century-old log building that had stood here long before any HOA board member had drawn their first self-righteous breath. "Complaints?" I kept my voice flat. "About what, precisely?" The second one, wiry and nervous, piped up, "Unapproved modifications, sir. Lack of adherence to community aesthetic guidelines. And, unpermitted habitation." I felt a muscle twitch in my jaw. This was beyond absurd. It was an invasion. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice dropping a fraction, a cold edge creeping in that they, in their blissful ignorance, failed to recognize. "This property is not, nor has it ever been, part of any homeowners association. You are trespassing." The beefy one chuckled, a dismissive, arrogant sound. "That's what they all say." "We have our records, and we have a notice for you." He thrust a folded paper at me. "You've got 30 days to bring this property into compliance, or face significant fines, daily. And eventually, eviction proceedings. Eviction from my own home, my grandfather's home. The place where my father taught me to track, to hunt, to be still and listen to the heartbeat of the forest." A cold fury, so familiar, so deeply buried, began to uncoil within me. I didn't take the paper. "I suggest you consult your maps again. And then, I suggest you leave my property." My eyes, I knew, had gone hard. They were the eyes that had stared down men with far more lethal intentions than these 2 clowns. "We're not leaving until you acknowledge receipt of this notice," Beefy stated, crossing his arms. "Karen sent us. Karen expects compliance." Karen. The name echoed with a certain archetype of suburban tyranny. I'd heard whispers about the new HOA president down the mountain, a woman whose reign was apparently characterized by an iron fist in a velvet glove, if the velvet glove was also made of iron and studded with rusty nails. "Karen," I repeated, the name tasting like ash. "Karen can expect whatever she likes." "You have 1 minute to be off my land before I call the sheriff and report you for trespassing and harassment." The wiry one shifted, looking towards the tree line. Beefy, however, stood his ground, emboldened by the cheap tin on his chest. "You threatening us? That's another violation." This was escalating beyond farce. This was a deliberate act of provocation. They weren't just mistaken, they were on a mission from Karen. "It's not a threat," I said, my voice now the calm before a surgical strike. "It's a statement of intent. Your minute started when you refused to leave." I glanced at the Winchester leaning just inside the door. They didn't see it. They saw a man in a flannel shirt, probably, in their minds, some ignorant hermit. They didn't see the years of training, the discipline, the carefully controlled capability that resided within. They saw what they wanted to see, what Karen wanted them to see. A target. The silence stretched, broken only by the wind sighing through the pines. The wiry one finally tugged on Beefy's sleeve. "Come on, Bill. We delivered the notice. Let's go." Bill, however, was made of sterner, stupider stuff. He took a step forward onto the porch proper. "You'll be hearing from our lawyers." He dropped the notice at my feet. "And from Karen." "Directly." They turned and crunched back down the gravel path, their departure as unwelcome as their arrival. I picked up the notice. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic overreach, citing bylaws that were as irrelevant to my existence as the mating habits of the Patagonian toothfish. Fines for unapproved sighting. It was log, as it had been for 100 years. Unkempt landscaping. It was a forest, by definition wild. And the catch-all, failure to maintain community standards. Community. My community was the deer, the bear, the ancient trees, not their manicured lawns and beige conformity. This wasn't just harassment. This was an attempt to erase something, to impose a sterile, artificial order on a place that thrived on its wildness. And Karen was the architect of this particular brand of idiocy. They crossed a line drawn not in surveyor's ink, but in history, in sweat, in bloodshed to protect sanctuaries like this. They didn't know it yet, but they had just declared war on the wrong man. The cabin wasn't just wood and stone. It was a repository of memory, a fortress of solitude. My grandfather, a man who'd seen his share of conflict in the Ardennes, had built it with his own hands, seeking peace after the cacophony of battle. My father, a cartographer who'd charted unforgiving terrains for clandestine government agencies, had found his solace here, teaching me the language of the land, the art of observation, the necessity of vigilance. This wasn't merely a property dispute. It was a desecration of legacy. The eviction notice, with its pompous legal jargon and thinly veiled threats, felt like a personal affront, a spit on their graves. Karen. The name became a focal point for the cold, methodical anger coalescing within me. She was more than an overzealous HOA president. She was the embodiment of a creeping, insidious encroachment that sought to homogenize, to control, to neuter the very spirit of independence. My family, the silent, watchful portraits on the mantelpiece, were my emotional anchor, their imagined disapproval a spur. My grandfather's stern gaze, my father's quiet disappointment. These were the justifications for the storm I was about to unleash. The first step, as always, was reconnaissance. The next morning, I drove down the mountain, not to the pastel-colored prison of Whispering Pines, but to the county records office. The clerk, a woman named Dottie with a beehive hairdo that defied gravity and a kindness that seemed out of place in such a sterile environment, was surprisingly helpful. "Whispering Pines?" she'd said, tapping her pen. "Oh, they're a lively bunch. Always some new regulation they're trying to push." I explained my situation, omitting the HOA cops and focusing on the boundary dispute. "My deed clearly shows my property line ending well north of their development," I stated, laying out my own survey map, a document my father had personally commissioned and verified decades ago. Dottie pulled up the plat maps for Whispering Pines. We spread them out, ancient crackling paper alongside modern GIS printouts. There it was, clear as day. Their development, a neat little rectangle carved out of the lower slopes. And then, surrounding it, vast tracts of land, including my parcel, all under a different ownership umbrella. "Well, that's peculiar," Dottie murmured, tracing lines with a perfectly manicured fingernail. "According to this, the original parcel that Whispering Pines was subdivided from—" "Wait a minute." She frowned. Then her eyes widened. She began cross-referencing older, almost forgotten ledgers, the kind bound in dusty leather, their pages whispering of transactions made long before computers hummed in county offices. My sidekick in this initial foray was an unexpected one. Old Jedediah Thorne, a local historian and conspiracy theorist who ran the town's antique shop. I'd stopped by for a coffee and a bit of local color, and Jedediah, hearing my tale of HOA overreach, had perked up like a bloodhound on a fresh scent. "Karen McNamara, you say?" He'd cackled, his eyes gleaming. "That woman thinks she's queen of all she surveys. But surveying, my boy? That's where the truth lies buried." He'd then regaled me with tales of forgotten land grants, shady developers from the 70s, and the complicated history of property lines in these mountains, a history often obscured by ambition and greed. He was the one who'd urged me to look beyond my immediate deed, to trace the lineage of the land itself. Back in the records office, Dottie finally looked up, a strange expression on her face. "Mr. Thorne was right to send you digging deeper," she said slowly. "The original land patent for this entire watershed, including the land Whispering Pines LLC bought for their development, it's quite old. Goes back generations." She then pointed to a name, a family name, on a deed so ancient it was written in elaborate fading script, my family name, my great-great-grandfather's name. It appeared he hadn't just owned the plot my cabin stood on, he'd owned the entire forest, the mountain slopes, the very land upon which Whispering Pines now sat, spewing its regulations and its enforcers. The developers in the 70s, it seemed, had bought their parcel from a distant, estranged branch of the family who likely had no clear title or had been misled about the extent of the original holdings. A transaction clouded by time and possibly deliberate obfuscation. But the core, overriding patent, the one that encompassed everything, it had never been legally subdivided or sold off in its entirety. It had passed down, intact, through my direct lineage. I owned it. I owned the entire goddamn forest. And, by extension, I owned the land their precious HOA stood on. The irony was so potent, it was almost a physical force. Karen and her HOA weren't just harassing a non-member, they were harassing their landlord, a landlord they didn't know existed. The reluctant warrior was now armed with something far more devastating than a Winchester. He was armed with the truth, etched in ink on crumbling parchment. A truth that would dismantle Karen's petty empire brick by beige brick. The cold fury within me didn't dissipate, it transformed. It became a focused, diamond-hard resolve. This wasn't just about defending my cabin anymore. This was about reclaiming what was mine, about restoring a natural order that Karen, in her hubris, had sought to disrupt. My emotional anchor, my family, now seemed to demand this. It was no longer just about peace. It was about justice, a justice that would be delivered with surgical precision. The drive back up the mountain was different. The trees seemed to stand taller, the wind through the pines whispering not of solitude, but of ancient rights, of a reckoning long overdue. The legal documents were a fortress, more impenetrable than any wall. The tactical plan began to form, a multi-stage operation designed for maximum impact and minimum collateral damage to the innocents. The other homeowners who were likely victims of Karen's tyranny as much as I was. Step 1. Formal, legal notification. Not to Karen directly, not yet. That would be too quick, too merciful. No, the opening salvo would be aimed at the foundations of her power, the HOA's legal counsel. I drafted the letter myself, borrowing from the precise, weaponized narration I'd employed in after-action reports from campaigns, far more kinetic but no less complex. It was a masterpiece of cold, legalistic fury. "To whom it may concern," it began. "It has come to my attention, as the registered owner of fee simple absolute title to the entirety of the lands commonly known as the Blackwood Forest Tract, per original patent recorded date book page, that a portion of said tract is currently occupied by an entity known as Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, Inc., and its constituent properties, without benefit of a valid lease, easement, or any other cognizable claim of right. I attached copies of the primordial deeds, the unbroken chain of title, the surveys, a barrage of irrefutable evidence." The letter continued. "You are hereby notified that any and all actions undertaken by Whispering Pines HOA Inc., its agents, officers, or representatives, including but not limited to the issuance of notices, fines, or threats of eviction against occupants of properties situated upon the Blackwood Forest Tract, are ultra vires, null, and void ab initio." I used their own pompous language against them, a rhetorical flourish designed to inflict maximum cognitive dissonance. The final paragraph was the kill shot. Whispering Pines HOA Inc. is hereby instructed to cease and desist immediately from any and all administrative, enforcement, or legal actions purporting to exercise authority over any portion of the Blackwood Forest Tract, Furthermore, you are instructed to provide, within 15 business days, full documentation establishing any claimed legal basis for your organization's presence on, and assertions of authority over, the aforementioned lands. Failure to comply will result in immediate legal proceedings for trespass, ejectment, and damages, including punitive damages for willful and malicious interference with quiet enjoyment of property. I sent it via registered mail, return receipt requested, to the HOA's registered agent and their listed law firm. The wait was not idle. I had my tech-savvy nephew, a young man who viewed the digital world as his personal playground and held a healthy disdain for officious bureaucrats, do a deep dive into Whispering Pines HOA Inc., its financials, its board meeting minutes, those publicly available at least, and any online chatter about Karen McNamara. The picture that emerged was grimly familiar. Escalating fees, arbitrary enforcement, a climate of fear, and Karen at the epicenter, a petty tyrant wielding the HOA bylaws like a scepter. He even found a few disgruntled homeowners on a private forum, my future rebellion fodder, already chafing under her rule. They just needed a catalyst. The drone surveillance in this context was purely digital, but the thermal camera overlay was the heat I could feel coming off the screen as I read about Karen's abuses. She'd fined an elderly woman for having a bird feeder deemed non-compliant. She'd forced a family to repaint their front door 3 times to achieve the precise shade of approved beige. She'd even tried to regulate the breed of dogs residents could own. This wasn't about community standards. It was about power, absolute and unchecked. The 15 days passed. On the 16th day, a thick envelope arrived. Not from the HOA's lawyers, but from a larger, more expensive-looking law firm. My letter had clearly caused a seismic shock. Their response was a masterclass in obfuscation and bluster, full of legalistic jargon intended to intimidate. They claimed adverse possession, prescriptive easement, estoppel by laches, a desperate scattergun blast of defenses, but they couldn't refute the core evidence of my title. They were stalling, hoping I was a crank who'd go away. They didn't know I wasn't just a crank. I was a crank with an unassailable legal position and the resources to see it through. This was the point of no return, the moral violation compounded by their lawyers' arrogance. They hadn't just trespassed, they were now actively trying to steal my land through legal sophistry. My response was swift and brutal. Step 2. The lawsuit. My legal ally was a semi-retired bulldog of a litigator, Arthur Jenkins, a man who'd made his name dismantling corrupt local officials and who relished a righteous fight. He'd represented my father in a complex zoning battle years ago and had a profound respect for my family's quiet tenacity. When I laid out the deeds, the chain of title, and the HOA's belligerent response, Arthur's eyes lit up with a predatory gleam. Magnificent, he'd rumbled, his voice like gravel, pure, unadulterated, legally sound vengeance. They won't know what hit them. The lawsuit we filed was not merely for trespass and ejectment. We included counts for slander of title due to their continued false claims of authority, tortious interference with my right to quiet enjoyment, and a request for a declaratory judgment affirming my ownership and invalidating any and all HOA covenants and restrictions as applied to any part of the Blackwood Forest tract. We also sought significant damages. The summons and complaint were served directly to Karen McNamara at the next HOA board meeting. I made sure of it. I hired a process server with a flair for the dramatic, a man who looked more like an undertaker delivering a final, solemn judgment. He walked into that meeting, right as Karen was pontificating about new rules for mailbox aesthetics, and served her in front of the entire board and a handful of attending residents. The silence, I was told by my nephew, who'd managed to get an ally to surreptitiously record the audio, was apocalyptic. Then, Karen's shriek. This was the shocking opening act of injustice, turned back upon its perpetrator. The news spread through Whispering Pines like wildfire. My lawsuit, a public record, was picked apart by curious residents. The revelation that their entire community might be built on land they didn't technically have full rights to, and that their HOA president had provoked the actual owner, sent shockwaves of panic and outrage. The silent majority was beginning to stir. Karen, predictably, doubled down. She sent out a furious email to all residents, decrying the frivolous and malicious lawsuit by an outside agitator seeking to destroy our community. She portrayed herself as the valiant defender of their property values and way of life. It was a classic narcissist's gambit, playing the victim while being the aggressor. But the cracks were showing. Her deadpan sarcasm, if she was capable of it, would have been to call me a concerned citizen. Instead, she was shrill. The legal battle was a grinding, relentless process, but Arthur Jenkins was a master tactician. Each motion they filed, we countered with surgical precision. Their claims of adverse possession crumbled under the weight of continuous ownership, and the fact that their occupation was as a purported subordinate entity, a development on purchased land, not as a hostile claimant against the true overarching title. Their prescriptive easement arguments were similarly weak, as my family had never formally granted such rights, and any informal access was permissive, not adverse. The estoppel by laches, the idea that I'd waited too long to assert my claim, was dismantled by demonstrating that the true extent of my ownership had only recently come to light, precisely because of their aggressive overreach. Discovery was a joy. We requested every document, every email, every financial record related to the HOA's land acquisition, its governance, and Karen's tenure. The zoom-ins on documents were literal as Arthur and I pored over their sloppy record-keeping, their inflated contracts, Karen's expense reports. We found evidence of mismanagement, self-dealing, and a pattern of vindictive enforcement. Karen's depositions were a highlight. Under Arthur's relentless, cold questioning, her carefully constructed facade of confident authority began to crack. Her answers became evasive, contradictory. Her intensely personal hatred for anyone who defied her was palpable in the transcripts. She couldn't comprehend that her power was illusory, built on a foundation of sand, or rather, my land. My inner monologue during this phase was a steady rhythm of tactical assessment. They parry with a motion to dismiss. We counter with summary judgment evidence. They attempt to bury us in discovery requests. We drown them in their own internal inconsistencies. The power paragraphs of our legal briefs laid out the undisputed facts with crushing clarity. The emotional undercurrents were there, a cold, satisfying burn of justice being meticulously assembled. The turning point came when the judge, a no-nonsense jurist named Henderson, reviewed the chain of title evidence. In a pre-trial hearing, he looked over his glasses at the HOA's high-priced lawyers and said, with a distinct lack of amusement, "Counsel, unless you can produce a document signed by a member of the plaintiff's direct ancestral line, explicitly severing and conveying the fee-simple title to the land your client's development sits upon, prior to their developer's purchase from a collateral relative, I'm having a hard time seeing how your clients aren't, at best, tenants at sufferance on land they believe they owned outright, and at worst, trespassers with a very expensive problem." The on-screen text of legal filings became a narrative of their impending doom. The color drained from their lead attorney's face. Karen, sitting in the gallery, looked like she'd swallowed a hornet's nest. The dramatic lighting change was metaphorical, the harsh glare of truth finally illuminating the shadows where her petty tyranny had festered. The local corruption ties we suspected were subtle, more about cozy relationships between developers and pliable local officials decades ago, creating ambiguities in records that Karen's predecessors had exploited. Unearthing these wouldn't change my land ownership, but it painted a picture of systemic sloppiness that allowed entities like Whispering Pines to take root where they shouldn't have. The blood in this war was metaphorical, the exsanguination of Karen's authority, the draining of the HOA's finances in legal fees defending the indefensible. The fence around my cabin, which had always been there, suddenly felt like a more potent symbol of defiance, a clear demarcation they had dared to cross. The porch light, which I switched on every evening, was a beacon of reclaimed control. The news headlines weren't national, but the local paper ran a carefully worded piece. Local landowner contests, HOA's land rights. It was enough. The neighbors, the residents of Whispering Pines, were now in open revolt. Faced with the prospect of their homes being on land with a clouded title, potentially invalidating their own deeds or subjecting them to a new landlord, me, They turned on Karen. An emergency meeting was called, not by Karen, but by a newly formed committee of concerned homeowners. My sidekick, Jedediah, gleefully reported that the atmosphere was less a meeting, more a public flaying. The climactic confrontation didn't need to be me personally facing Karen down in a dramatic showdown. The law was doing that for me. But I did attend that emergency homeowners meeting at the invitation of the concerned committee. I wasn't there to gloat or to threaten. I was there to offer a solution. I walked in, and the room fell silent. Karen was at the front, looking haggard and furious, flanked by a few remaining loyalists. Most of the faces, though, were anxious, angry, and looking for answers. I took the offered microphone. "Good evening." I began, my voice calm, measured. "My name is Protagonist's name. As you now know, my family has held title to the Blackwood Forest Tract for over a century and a half. This includes the land upon which Whispering Pines was built." I paused, letting it sink in. My dispute was never with you, the homeowners. It was with an HOA that overstepped its bounds, that harassed me on my private property, and that, it turns out, was operating without a clear legal right to the land it claimed to govern. I outlined the history, the deeds, the clear legal standing. I didn't embellish. The facts were damning enough. Then, I made my offer. I have no desire to evict hundreds of people from their homes. That is not my intention, nor has it ever been. A collective sigh of relief went through the room. However, the current HOA, as constituted, is untenable. Its authority is illegitimate. I proposed a new arrangement, the dissolution of the existing HOA. I would then grant new individual land leases, or offer to sell clear title to the individual plots directly to the homeowners at a fair, independently assessed market value for the land only, a value significantly less than they feared, as it wouldn't include the HOA premium they'd been unknowingly paying for. The covenants and restrictions would be minimal, focused on basic safety and environmental protection, not on the color of mailboxes or the breed of dogs. Essentially, I said, you would own your homes on land you have a clear legal right to occupy, free from the arbitrary rule of the current HOA board. You would be neighbors, not subjects. Karen finally erupted. "This is an outrage. He's trying to destroy our community. He's a charlatan. Don't listen to him." But her voice was drowned out by a chorus of angry shouts from the residents directed at her. "You lied to us, Karen. You wasted our money. You put our homes at risk." The public embarrassment of the villain was complete. She was a queen dethroned, her power shattered by the one thing she couldn't bully or bulldoze: the truth. The law enforcement or legal ally, in this case Judge Henderson, later issued a summary judgment in my favor, affirming my ownership and striking down the HOA's claims. The official arrest warrant was for the HOA itself, a legal death sentence. The old HOA was dissolved. Karen McNamara resigned in disgrace, reportedly selling her house at a loss given the title uncertainties she herself had precipitated, and moving far away, hopefully to a place with no authority for her to abuse. The transition was complex but orderly. Most residents opted to purchase their land parcels from me, securing clear title for the first time. A few chose long-term leases. A new voluntary community association was formed, focused on actual community needs, not on enforcing aesthetic tyranny. My tactical ops metaphor had played out. Reconnaissance, records office, intelligence gathering, nephew, Jedediah, strategic strike, lawsuit, and securing the objective, justice and peace. The surprise reversal was complete. The victim of harassment was revealed as the ultimate authority. The locked gate was metaphorical, the closing of a chapter of aggression, the restoration of boundaries. The symbolic revenge tied to family legacy was the quiet satisfaction of knowing my grandfather's forest, his sanctuary, was now truly secure, its integrity preserved against the encroachment of petty despots. I still live in my cabin. The woods are quieter now, or perhaps I just listen to them differently. The cold-blooded calm remains, but the explosive emotional undercurrents have settled into a deep, abiding peace. Sometimes, a car from the newly reorganized Whispering Pines community drives by on the main road, miles below my property line. They don't come up my gravel path anymore. They know who owns the forest. They know who I am. They finally learned to check their maps. And I, the reluctant warrior, have returned to my earned solitude, the Winchester oiled, the porch light on, a silent guardian of a legacy they almost, but not quite, managed to disturb. The air in my woods is clean again.